Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Long Hill Report. I am Richard Morchoe and joined by
Hello, how are you all?
Steeves. Yeah. And this is the May,
May.
May
It is
issue.
May. Yes.
Yeah. And we're starting,
Doesn't feel much like May at the moment.
no,
Feels
it's
like
not.
April or
It's
March.
the weather
but
outside has been dreary. We need some sun, but we're going to go on.
It's
And,
supposed to get in the 70s later this week, though, so that'd be nice.
well, it's going to be an interesting weekend. I haven't decided if I'm going to the Coronation or the Kentucky Derby. And I'm wondering,
Or the coronation of the king.
I'm wondering if he was named after the spaniel, or the spaniel was named after him. So
Good question.
Is it a King George Spaniel, or is King George? I don't want to go there any further. Are you going to talk about? You want to talk about local elections?
Well, I was thinking that right now we're kind of in the middle of the local democracy cycle, and I think that's always really important that we don't, in our society, we don't talk anywhere near enough about people getting involved in local politics, in the fact that there's so much promotion of state and federal level politics, but the local races are the places where literally one or two votes can make a difference. And like, for example, this week we had our Oxford's town meeting was this week. Oxford's election is on the 16th. Webster's election is coming up in June. Our election at Southbridge is coming up in June. And it's interesting that you, looking at them, you know, as you know, I'm a reporter, so I've been kind of following these towns, and we have that a couple of our towns, the towns that I generally do a lot of writing about, in Webster and Sturbridge, really didn't have much in the way of elections this year. They didn't have Webster doesn't have, unless something has changed since the last time I looked at it with some write-in, Webster doesn't have any opposed races. Sturbridge had a couple of minor races that were opposed, specifically Recreation Committee, and one of their two school boards had opposition. But Oxford has 4 people running for their select board for 2 seats, and Southbridge has 8 running for 3 council seats, which is one of the bigger races we've had in quite a few years. So I think it's really important that people remember to get out and vote in all of these towns, and if there are towns that have town meetings, participate in those too, because that's where democracy actually happens.
In answer to you.
I didn't think I asked a question.
Well, in answer to the whole, it is in a way, you know, a point you make, so it begs, so what do you think about that? And what I think about that is, yeah, you're right. Yeah, just mea culpa, because I do not get hugely involved in town politics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a good thing. I know. I will go to vote.
Mm-hmm.
I will swear I'm going to the town meeting. And I'd rather stab myself in the leg than stay up till 11:30, and it ends up that way. And I'm not proud of it, not at all. I think it was one of those, an article, not a book or something about about the settlement of America, and they said about the New England town meeting,
Mm-hmm.
it was democracy, but people usually didn't go to their town, even in colonial times or pre-colonial, colonial times. They didn't even go unless things weren't going right.
Well, in some towns, under some circumstances, they actually were required to go.
Yeah.
And that did obviously
They're
change
also
over
required
years.
to go to church too.
Well, that is true.
Or else, boom.
There was back in those days, there was a lot of really suspicious overlap between church and state.
Yes, and so if you're required to go, is that really democracy?
Well, if you're participating and you're going and you are as informed as you can be,
that's democracy.
I think it makes a difference.
That's democracy, but if you're coerced, is it really democracy?
I think it depends on how it works.
Well,
Because I know in Australia, for example, they're legally required to vote.
yeah, I think that's wrong.
I think on the flip side, there's something to be said for something like that, but it's I don't know how you balance it off in such a way where you want people to participate as informed citizens, and I think encouraging people to vote is important. But does it? I'm not sure if it really matters if they're just there because they have to be. I think you do have a point. I guess the question is, how do we make sure that our educational system teaches people the value of actually participating, rather than the kind of sham democracy that we increasingly see today?
Okay.
Which I think is more real at the local level than it is certainly at the federal level.
When you say you want the, my point was going to be about how that book, and I think it was Albion C maybe. I think I remember it saying people only went when there was something, something went wrong.
Often that is true, yeah.
Something important came up that was controversial. Otherwise, they were pretty happy with the way, or okay with it. Nobody's probably ecstatic, but being okay is that. The times I've gone and seen a humongous crowd at the town meeting, standing room only, going out into the hall, was something about the schools.
Usually, yeah.
And when at the end of the day, I thought the discussion of it was horrible and vapid and meaningless. And that's the problem. That, what is education and things like that? Nobody asks. I remember someone running for what do you call it? Board of Education.
Okay.
What do we call it? Is that
The school
board?
Yeah.
And I'm asking her about discussion, and I got too deep into the weeds of the whole thing with her. And I remember, I'm not going to say the name of the school. It was one of the seven sisters.
Okay.
And she said to me, and I went to such and such a school. So then I said to her, at one point I got to this, well, what is the definition of education? Well, what is the definition of education?
I don't think I've ever read the actual formal definition of it. I think it's one of those things it's one of those words that you know what it is when you see it.
I disagree.
Almost.
And I wouldn't have disagreed with you, except I went to I was probably one of history's worst students. I was a goof off. I went to college to get away from my wonderful parents. My divine parents were the kindest and most generous, but I wanted to get away.
Kids usually do. Yeah.
I wanted to have a 4-year party.
Yeah, kids usually do.
But they were serious about education. You were required to have at least 4 semesters of philosophy. And they made you read Newman's idea of a university. That was required to read before you went to college.
Okay.
So I'm one of the few people who's ever seen the definition of education, and it's the training of the mind, the knowledge for its own sake, and the training of the mind, and that's it.
That's fine.
So,
okay, that's a good definition.
Learning your times tables is nice, not education. In fact, it's necessary, but it's not education. Everything you do through high school is preparatory, but not education. It's preparatory for education, and we don't care about education, really, because
in our society, we don't.
We wouldn't have college majors like marketing or gender studies or things like that. Those are not part of an education. They might have their own value, but they're not part of an education. So when I said, She had no clue what education was.
Maybe that may be true, but I think that, I think there's really like more than one definition of education. You've got the one that you just stated, and then you've got the more broader definition of the concept, which basically comes down to workforce training. It is. I think it's a form of education.
But then you're saying anything is education as long as it's some kind of training.
No, let me finish. To some degree, it is. But I think what you're trying to point out is the kind of old school, as you pointed out, philosophy of education. And I think there's certainly a benefit to that. But I think there's also an issue of the fact that our society does not, quite frankly, really want educated people in too many ways. I mean, it's much more important for our society to have people trained to do X, Y, or Z relatively well than to understand how X, Y, and Z fit into society, or understand how they work or how they don't work. Because understanding those kinds of things, which I think would be genuine education, will encourage people to take a look at them and go, maybe we shouldn't be doing it this way. And there are people that are in the powers that be that benefit greatly by keeping those things the way they are. And to some degree, our entire society does, because our entire society does not really value change, despite the fact that we talk about it a lot.
Well, I don't value change unless it has a real value in and of itself.
Unless it has, and that's a good reason to do it. I agree. I mean, you shouldn't be just changing for the sake of chaos. That doesn't work.
Well, I will say the value of the definition that I got of an education is I got to think about why we have education, or what we call education at all.
Right.
And I think 90% of it could go away. And we could, stop calling marketing education. Call it training.
It is.
Call gender studies and things like that indoctrination. But
Well, marketing is all indoctrination too.
well, marketing is
As Edward
vocab.
Bernays told us, everything he talked about was public relations, which was just the way he changed his terminology for propaganda. He knew it.
But it's not.
It was all
education.
propaganda.
It's not education. It's training. It's indoctrination, as we said. It's just that's the whole thing. It's maybe there is a useful aspect of marketing. Maybe it does get you to try something. Like one of the things I remember reading about that they marketed toothpaste for something that it really didn't have as a value, but they got people to use toothpaste, and the amount of cavities in the country plummeted.
Okay.
Okay, you told a slight little fib, but you did a good thing. All right, how is that valued?
On the flip side, it's also gone exactly the other way, where they tell the lies that get people to do things that are long-term detrimental to them.
Exactly.
Like the whole idea of getting people to smoke. That was done exactly the same way in reverse.
That was sold to women.
Absolutely, as to make it cool and sexy and all this other stuff.
The torches of freedom, they were called.
Exactly.
Yeah. So right, but I do think we should just use education for the idea of the training of the mind, and we shouldn't be spending as much for marketing classes.
Oh, I totally agree with that.
And people going with a $30,000, $50,000, $100,000 debt out of college for that.
I agree with that. Totally.
That basically is an IQ test, in a way.
To some degree it is, but the problem is even our IQ tests are really skewed.
Well, they may be, but then that's an even more real IQ test than an IQ test.
Maybe.
But I wrote years ago, The Value of Education, an article in the Sturbridge Times Magazine that basically I said, well, what do we really value? We'd find out if we lost all garbage men, and
Sure.
and the garbage started to pile over. Hey, can we get a no? But we can't get a garbage man. They're gone. But we can get a sociologist here. Now,
Hope he knows how to drive a garbage truck.
is my contention that if every sociology teacher, professor in the world disappeared, the world wouldn't be better, or maybe it would be better, but it would be no worse.
I think we could say the same about marketing teachers mostly too.
Possibly.
And economists,
Possibly.
most of the economists too.
Now, I know somebody's going to get after me on gender studies. But yeah, probably, most. Now, history is what I've always, and why I was able to get through college was I did love to read and study history. But if all the historians went, could I defend that the world would be a worse, a better place? I don't think I could say it would be better or worse if the historians went, but if the really, truly great books of history were effaced, yes, I would say that would be bad.
I think you're probably right in general. I think that part of the problem is that when you start diving into history, you start. Let me backtrack. I think it's really critical, and that's one of the things our society doesn't do very well at all, is teach history. It's getting worse as time goes along. Because we're not encouraged to learn history to understand both what happened and what is happening. And that's why we keep getting trapped in the same cycles over and over again, because we don't understand history.
How do you understand it? Boy, I'd like to make the embarrassing question, but how do you understand it?
How do I understand history?
Yes.
I think it's, as I started to kind of say, I think history is often cyclical. And there are many aspects of it that if we try to understand the cycles, we can see where they're going. And I don't know if that necessarily means we'll be able to change them.
Well, you know what
But I
Mark
think-
Twain said?
Huh?
You've heard Mark Twain's statement.
About what
History
specifically?
does not repeat, but it does rhyme.
Yeah,
And I
right,
think I go
right.
with that.
I do too.
Yeah.
I do too.
But how do you like right now I'm trying to work on writing. I think you know Baggett Gloves, The Fate of Empires.
Yep.
I'm trying to analyze that and where we are now too.
Right.
And I reviewed, I think his name is Cullen Murphy,
Okay.
his Are We Rome?
Okay.
And I see some value in it, but I think he went awry at some point, and maybe he'll read me and say, boy, were you an idiot. But it's really a very difficult thing.
Oh, of
It's-
course.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you're somebody who reads history. And
I
I'll
think-
say what I say to myself when I look in the mirror. Good luck with that, pal.
I'm not disagreeing with that. Understanding it and trying to work through the weeds of history is not easy.
Wait a minute here. It's not easy?
It shouldn't be.
Because
Because you're literally talking about everything humanity's ever done if you're doing it right.
Well, you know what Cicero said. A person who does not know of events before his own time remains ever a child.
True.
Now,
Right.
when Cicero said that, basically it was just Greece and Rome and what Herodotus wrote about other than Greece and Rome.
But the problem, see, that's part of the problem, unfortunately.
That
with
is the
history,
problem. That is, and yeah.
Is that history so easily shades into propaganda.
Well, would you
It
think?
becomes really difficult. That's why you need to read so much of it to understand history.
Well, you have to read it with a
to work to with
a jaundiced eye there.
many respects. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do have an advantage in our society, if you're willing to take advantage of it, is that we have access today, partially because of the internet, to so many sources of history and documents and ideas
Which is
and people.
the problem.
But-
How do you take the right source?
I think the key is you need to read as many as you can. So that you can get the idea that, granted, reading something from any particular nation is going to be skewed more or less to favor that nation. That's just the way propaganda works. But when you read enough from this country and enough from this culture and enough from this area in history and enough from this area in history and people who are willing to synthesize all of these ideas, then you can take a look at them and realize, okay, that makes some sense and that makes some sense. I recognize that this is very skewed propaganda, and so is this. But you can combine them and go, okay, get rid of the propaganda elements of it, and these still all make sense.
Okay,
they all kind of line
I'm
up.
speaking seriously here.
Yeah, I know, I get it.
I'm
So am I.
speaking seriously. You're going to think I'm being insulting. I'm not.
Okay.
You have to write it out. You have to come up with a thesis that means the most to you, and you have to write your book. And I encourage you to do this. I'm not being a jerk. Well,
Okay.
maybe I am, but I'm really trying to say, okay, I want to see you. I want you to prove your point,
Uh-huh.
and you've got to write it out. And are you working on it now?
I'm not writing about that now.
Let's get to work here, because it's as important. It's as important a thing as you can do. Mm-hmm. I tried to make a point in what I wrote that we need to go to a neutralist foreign policy. Right. The whole thing has been, other than for a couple of events, a mistake, an absolute mistake.
It has been.
And I went through the sweep.
Actually, the catch was it really a mistake? Somebody benefited from
that. I don't disagree.
That's the catch. It's always somebody is running the foreign policy to benefit.
Hawaii was piracy.
Yeah.
It wasn't a mistake for the Dole family at all.
Right.
But it was a mistake for the nation.
Most of the problem is the people who run our nation do not really care about the nation.
Exactly, which is another reason I wrote the book.
We are run by pirates.
We are run by pirates, which is,
we have always been run. Most nations have been run by pirates.
Yes, and so. I'm sorry, our audience. Did our audience have something? We have not a large audience, but what did I? Could you?
Oh, plug the pirate party here.
The pirate party. We have our own little Grania O'Malley here, who was the famous pirate queen.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to go and move on, because I'm pushing Gus to write his book, and on the aspect of history that he finds most important. And we're going to give him, he doesn't have to bring it next month. We'll give him a month. Well, we might even give him 4 months.
I actually did write something on a kind of my exploration of Muslim history. Hasn't been published, but
okay.
I took it as a reverse. I took it as a reverse exploration of Muslim history.
How many pages have you gotten so far?
Oh, it's done.
How many pages?
I try to remember exactly. 200 and something. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Okay. So all right.
I originally wrote it as an atlas, and I've got the maps drawn up, and I would have to rearrange them to kind of get them all to fit, because I've got they're like all over the place and size wise, and I have to kind of consolidate them all into like one page size. That's the hard part, because it doesn't really fit. So
we're going to go into another aspect that is not sweeping the country, but it's a little bit of a movement called Defend the Guard. Mm-hmm. And it is that no state guard can be federalized unless the state approves.
Right.
Not the government says we want troops to go on to our next adventure, our next Afghanistan, our next
Somalia or
whatever,
Chad or wherever it is they are now.
You have to get the approval of the state. And there are states that are trying to push this in their legislatures.
Right.
In Massachusetts, so far, I wouldn't say it's the white heat of apathy, but it has not caught fire.
Pretty quiet, yeah.
There is a small group that is pushing it in our state. Mm-hmm. I'm not big. I don't know how the level of, but there are other states that are doing it with quite a bit more fervor.
Yes. They tend to be the more conservative states, actually.
Yeah,
which doesn't surprise me.
Well, conservatism basically would be that way.
Yeah, it would be. Sure.
Generally speaking, conservatism has been seen as pro-war for many, many years. That is not conservatism.
No, that's true. That's neocon.
The guy, Burnham, who wrote the book that the Managerial Society, that Orwell took his
Right.
ideas for 1984 from, said progressivism is an ideology, liberalism is an ideology, conservatism is not an ideology, it is a reaction.
Okay.
Now,
To some degree, that's true, but it's also, I think, conservatism is often a setup where people have, they don't. It's not necessarily a reaction, as it is. It's the way people have always wanted to just live their lives until something else comes up that they see as making them worse.
well, that's not an ideology then. Whereas the other things are socialism's an ideology.
Well, yeah, of course.
Marxism's an
Yeah.
conservatism is reaction to something. And
Sometimes.
now, when Buckley started the conservative movement, National Review, and stuff like that, he claimed it was standing athwart history and saying stop. But
Okay.
he was a war party warrior,
Right.
which he pushed. Now, he got to take a lot of Middle America with him in this for a long time. But once you get rid of the big bugaboo of the Soviet Union, you then have to justify the wars. And the general real conservatism would say, okay, prove it. And it didn't, but they tried to push it and amalgamate it with neoconservatism.
True.
The neoconservatives have gone away from conservatism now completely.
Yeah.
They don't want it because they want to keep their war party going.
Well, they're not conservative or liberal. They're imperialists.
Essentially, yeah. But they
Yeah.
called it themselves neoconservatives.
True,
And
but-
they did a nice little dance with that.
And the neoliberals mean pretty much exactly the same thing.
They've amalgamated.
They've been the same thing for a
Yeah,
long time.
they've amalgamated.
I mean, the problem I think with both neocon and neoliberal is that if you look at both of them, they are in practice old school capitalist, where they favor the consolidation of economic and political power, of course, in their own hands, as imperialists always do.
Well,
But they use it but they justify it by arguing for either quote unquote liberal ideas or quote unquote conservative ideas, which they are just manipulating because they don't actually follow them anyway.
well, libertarians would disagree with you on much of that, in that it's old school capitalism to them would be non-interference with people and living your life as you want or can without treading on anybody else's feet and demanding, or trying to consolidate within the state.
The problem is I understand that argument. The problem is, and I have a problem with it because in practice, capitalism always has tried to step on people.
But that's
Throughout
not,
history, it has
libertarians would
always
say
done
that's
that.
not capitalism.
But it is capital. If you see
What-
something that is constantly recurring in the same system, and the system is promoting the idea, an underlying idea of capitalism, is that selfish behavior is supposedly
That
a
is
social good.
that is
That's the
Adam
underlying-
Smith. Yes,
that's the
but
underlying
not,
idea of
that
capitalism.
would not be libertarians. That would libertarians then isn't capitalism.
But that
It's-
is what capitalism is defined as.
That
is
would be-
is
that's
that
Adam-
selfish
Adam
behavior is
Smith.
beneficial to society. That is by definition sociopathic.
No, the baker, as he said, the baker, the butcher's baker, the candlestick maker, they're doing what they're doing for themselves, but they're also serving you. And that in and of itself is not a horrible thing, but it is capitalism.
Under some circumstances, that's true. But the
Where
problem is,
you-
when you have that underlying
Well-
ideology, you end up creating a circumstance where you get the people who will purposely do anything they can that is blatantly criminal in their own interest.
That ain't the butcher
stepping
baker.
on you.
That's not the butcher, baker, and candlestick maker.
No, they're not. But
We
that
are-
comes out of the same system.
That
When
is
you
for
have
not-
that,
we
when
have
you
to at
have
this
that
point.
worldview, that's where it's going to start.
We have to, because we've reached the limit, and we have to go. But we expect you to be working on getting that book ready. You will be asked about it. Don't think you're escaping. This has been the Long Hill Report with Gus Steeves and Richard Morchoe. Next month.
You too.